Believe it or not, we lie to ourselves on a daily basis. Actually, most of our thoughts are not objective truths. They are just internalized opinions from society, from culture, from thoughts that we're so used to thinking that we think that they're the truth. But so many of them are just straight up lies. So today we're going to talk about how to stop lying to yourself, i.e., how to break patterns of negative self-talk, because nearly all of negative self-talk is a form of self-deception. But before we get into it, I would like to read a podcast review from a dear listener who wrote, "This podcast is absolutely wonderful. Each episode inspires me and resonates so much. A lot of what Mary talks about is what is on my heart all the time and have never known to put into words. If you want to listen to a beautiful human inside and out, tell you all about self-love, body positivity, and how to feel inspired to make some influential changes in the world, give this podcast a try." Thank you so much to anyone and everyone who's ever left a nice review, a positive comment, a rating. Those mean so much to me, like on an energetic level. They keep me going, and really they do help the show grow. So thank you. So now let's talk about how to stop lying to yourself and how to actually be honest with yourself. Like I mentioned at the beginning, we lie to ourselves on a daily basis. We try to convince ourselves that we're not good enough, not capable enough, not confident enough, that we don't have what it takes to go after what we want. Why? Because it keeps us safe. We lie to ourselves as a way to keep making excuses and keep being stuck in the reality that we're in because we're used to it, because it's comfortable, because it might be shitty, but at least it's familiar and I know exactly what to expect. We try to convince ourselves that we like someone when we don't, because we don't want to make them upset. We're going to talk about lying to other people, i.e. people pleasing, in the next episode, so I'll put a pin in that one. But we also try to convince ourselves that we don't like someone when actually we might just be jealous or projecting our own insecurities onto them. We lie to ourselves by not taking responsibility, by blaming other people for our feelings, our emotions. We, again, project on other people and we say, this is how it should be. This is what they should do. That's a form of lying to yourself. We also lie to ourselves by taking too much responsibility, that kind of self-blame that makes us feel like everything is our fault, that everything is within our control, when it's not. Most things are completely outside of our control. It is what it is, right? One of my favorite meditation teachers, Tara Brach, she said, you can only be as honest as you are aware. So really what we're talking about in this episode is self-awareness. And I've said this to you before so many times, or perhaps you inferred it from just the way that I talk about self-love in general, because this is a self-love podcast, but self-love cannot exist without self-awareness, without being truly, deeply honest, authentic, in integrity, genuine, transparent, just pure you. That is the foundation of self-love. You have a lot of self-awareness. I know you do. Sometimes even a little too much self-awareness, right? Where it ends up going into that extreme of taking responsibility for everything that maybe isn't even your fault, or intellectualizing everything to a point where you're disconnected from true feeling and being with yourself. And then you might also have times of spiraling into negative self-talk. I just want to be honest with you from the get-go. I spent 4.5 hours trying to record this episode for you yesterday, but I just kept spiraling. I felt like nothing I was saying was good enough. I thought that my message was unclear. I didn't even know if this would resonate with people because, why would you click on an episode titled Stop Lying to Yourself? Because most people don't think they're lying to themselves. It's this, insidious habit that we have. And I just couldn't do it. And I ended my day yesterday in tears and feeling so unworthy. And the word that I used was useless. And when I got into this terrible pattern, of course, the first thing that I did after I beat myself up about it, I walked out of this office and I went over to my husband's office and I'm like, the problem is you. The reason why I can't record this podcast episode is because you're in the house and you told me that you would not be home today so I would have the space to record my podcast episode. And now I'm feeling insecure and anxious because you're here and I can't do my work. That's a lie. That's a lie. He was not the problem. He was not the reason why I was feeling unworthy about recording this podcast episode, right? But I lied to myself in that moment. I tried to put it onto somebody else because that was a little bit easier for me than to admit that I'm feeling unworthy. I'm not feeling good enough. I spiraled and I feel trapped in my own mind. That is me being honest with myself. But it took me a couple hours, well, maybe a full 24 hours to really get there, to, of course, apologize to him and to recognize that anytime we are being dishonest with ourselves, even if it's on the most minuscule, small level that we think is no big deal, it's just a little white lie, it's helpful, it might protect somebody else's feelings. What it does is it eats away pieces of your soul. And when you're being dishonest, when you're operating from a place of self-deception, you block yourself from love, both your own self-love and love from other people. Perfect example is just picking a fight with someone, right? Projecting your own insecurities, feeling that anxious, agitated state. And it all stems from not being able to say, I feel lonely. I'm insecure. I need help. I don't know. I'm stuck. It's like these small statements. I remember a really long time ago, I saw this Pinterest quote and I have no idea what the attribution was. I just remember it really landing with me that 10 years later, I'm remembering it. It was called 4 Things That Brave People Say Often. And the list was, I'm sorry, thank you, I love you, and I don't know. Think about how honest those 4 statements are. I'm sorry, admitting that you are showing remorse, that you don't want this to happen again, that you're willing to take responsibility. Thank you, the honesty of pure gratitude, of expressing some kind of just adoration for someone else's doing. I'm sorry, thank you, I love you. For a lot of people, it's hard to admit when they're feeling vulnerable enough to love. That's also a type of transparency. And it also involves a risk because every time we say, I love you, there's this small risk of rejection. And then I don't know. And that's the one that hit me the most because I will admit one of my toxic traits is researching all the time and just absorbing information and then packaging it up to teach it to other people, kind of like how I do on this podcast. This is where I really thrive. So it is hard for me to admit, like, I was wrong. I don't know the answer. I don't know how I feel about that, especially as of late with all the current events happening in the world and so much mis and disinformation being spread and us being pulled in so many different directions when it comes to like how to think and feel. It almost feels like other people are constantly deciding for us what they would do. And then they project that this is what you should do and what you should think and who you should stand by. And sometimes it feels like so liberating to say, I don't know how I feel about that. Let me think about it. Let me get back to you. Let me, read up on it. Let me not have an immediate, perfectly packaged response for you right away. Like, to me, saying, I don't know, feels vulnerable and thus courageous, because we know that courage is the other side of vulnerability. So let's talk about how to be more honest with yourself. And let's start by deciphering between a truth and a lie. Okay, because so many of us, again, we're operating from this assumption that all these thoughts that we think are true. And what's that quote attributed to Buddha? Like, don't believe everything you think. And then there's, so many lies or maybe so many opinions that we take as the end all be all truth, when really they might just be an opinion, a suggestion, a projection, how things have always been and this is how they always will be, and nobody dares challenges them, including you in your own mind. And that's really what I am inviting, calling you, insisting that you do, is develop that level of self-inquiry where you're constantly not questioning yourself because you're doubtful of yourself, but questioning your thoughts, because your thoughts are separate from yourself, and being able to separate, question, and strategically, intentionally choose what you want to think, what you want to believe. That's the type of self-awareness and self-love that I really want all of us to step into. So how can you tell a truth from a lie? This is the best analogy I could come up with. I'm not the best at metaphors, but stay with me, maybe it'll land. Imagine you are walking out of the ocean or the beach, right? You just spent a day on the beach. And you know how when you leave the water, the sand kind of sticks to your feet, right? As you're walking out, the sand sticks to your feet. And as you get into dry sand, it becomes like heavy to walk upon because your feet are getting stuck in the sand, right? So there's this moment where you're like, oh, I can't run. My dad and I used to play tag on the beach, and it was the most exhausting tag ever, particularly because it's so hard to run in dry sand when your feet are kind of like sinking into it with every step. So imagine you're walking away from the ocean into this sand that kind of like encaptures your foot with every step. And then as you keep on walking closer and closer away from the shore and into dry land, what happens is that the sand starts drying up off your feet. It falls effortlessly. It ends up, kind of having little remnants in between your toes. But aside from that, it becomes really easy to walk, right? And it's just, you wipe your foot off with socks and then you don't think about it anymore and you can move on with your life. That's what telling the truth feels like. It might feel a little bit heavy, a little bit uncomfortable in those first few steps where you feel like you're sinking, but you're not. And then it's liberating. The sand falls off on its own. Everything just comes to be naturally without you even trying that hard. If you've ever been to the beach, you know that there's really no way to wash your feet, because if you go back into the water, try to rinse out your feet, then all you're doing is making your feet wet for more sand to stick on later. So the only way out is really through. You just got to wait it out, let the sand dry, let it fall. Again, I am not the best at metaphors, but I compare this type of feeling of telling the truth with sand falling off your feet after the beach, because it comes with a sense of lightness, of rejuvenation, of a sigh of relief that you didn't even have to work that hard for. You just had to do the first few steps that felt a little bit, in the sand, but then you came out of it on the other end and everything just unfolds as it should around you. Now, imagine, I hope you've never been in this situation, but imagine you are on a riverbank getting stuck in quicksand. That's what lying feels like. It's that quicksand that sucks you in, that keeps you stuck, that when you keep walking, you actually bring yourself deeper and deeper into that mud, into those lies. That's what negative self-talk feels like, right? It's like quicksand. It's like the more you continue doing it, the more it sucks you in. It becomes this habit. It weighs you down. You can't get out of it without help. So think about your self-talk. If it feels heavy, debilitating, suffocating, like quicksand, then it's a lie. And I know you might think like, well, Mary, my self-talk, like I tell myself that I'm not good enough because I really am not good enough. How does that feel in your body? Does that feel like beach sand? Does that feel like the truth? Or does that just feel so heavy? So how can you make your thoughts feel and be more truthful? The key to being honest with yourself is specificity. Being specific with what you're thinking, what you're saying, what you're believing. Lies are very generic. They're very like blanket, like a wet blanket. They kind of just weigh you down. Truths are more nuanced. They're more intricate. They have many different layers and components. That's why it's so important to talk with a trusted friend, to journal, to have time with yourself, right? To be in therapy where somebody else is guiding you into that self-inquiry, where they tell you, like a therapist isn't going to say, you're wrong, that's not actually how you feel. They're just going to insert some more reframes, some more elements of things that might be true over and over and over again until hopefully they land. So hopefully that statement of I'm not good enough becomes I don't feel good enough when I spend time with my mother who is constantly criticizing me. Now that's a better truth than I'm not good enough because my mom said I'm not. Adjusting that statement just a little bit, which hopefully you've learned to do in a place like therapy, like I don't feel good enough when I spend too much time with my mother because the way she talks to me is being perceived as self-criticism in my head. That's a more truthful truth, and the key lies in that specificity. There's this teacher, life coach that I follow. Her name is Byron Katie, and she came up with this process of self-inquiry, which has helped me so much with any kind of like negative experience that I'm having that I no longer want to have. And it goes as follows. There's just 4 very simple questions, but you can only answer, well, let me walk you through them. 4 very simple questions. The first one you can only answer using a yes or a no. And that is this true? Whatever experience you're having, is this true? So let me take yesterday as an example where I said, I'm not good enough to be podcasting. I don't know anything that I'm talking about. I'm not, skilled at this and nobody's going to listen to my podcast. Is this true? And I can only answer with a yes or a no. Sometimes, it's frequently the case that right away you'll be like, no, that's not true. And again, the key is that it has to be a yes or no answer. Okay, so say you're really stuck in those beliefs and you answer yes, like yes, it's true that nobody is going to listen to my podcast. The second question is, how do you know that it's true? How do you know? And this is where Byron Katie calls you to give some piece of evidence. Like, how do you know? My mom also loves asking me this, and she has this thick Russian accent. So sometimes I hear her voice in my head being like, how do you know? How do you know? And that's what I think about. How do you know? How do I know that nobody's going to listen to this podcast? Well, I don't, right? So my self-inquiry process kind of ends there. And it's confronting. It helps you realize like how ridiculously dramatic, catastrophic some of your thoughts are. And they're completely not true with no evidence or backing to it. But sometimes, again, it feels very true. So say we're working with a thought that's like, I'm too ugly to date and to be loved by another person romantically. Is this true? And you might be so deep in that you say yes. Yes, that's true. That lie is true. And then the second question is, how do you know? And you'll be like, well, I went through a breakup a couple years ago and the person literally told me that I was too ugly to love. Say that actually happened to you, right? Sometimes these things happen and they're traumatic and extreme. And of course they feel so true and you have all the evidence to back that up. Well, now we move on to the third question that Byron Katie says you ask. Is this true? How do you know that it's true? And the third one is, who would I be without that belief? Who would I be? And the way you answer this is by being the person that you are afraid to be. There's a same meditation teacher, Tara Brach. She says the work that is the most important, the question to answer is, what are you unwilling to feel? What are you unwilling to feel? What is scary for you? And that question of who would I be without that belief, the answer usually lies in the person that you're scared to be. Who would you be? Well, maybe you would be free to date. You would be vulnerable. You would be open-hearted. You would feel a little bit nervous to put yourself out there. You would have to be open to receiving love. That's who you would be without the belief of I'm not lovable. And that really shows you that these lies that we tell ourselves, they're all fear-based. The shitty things that you say to yourself, all of that negative self-talk that spirals, all of these are lies. They are just stories to keep you small, to keep you sort of safe, and to keep you super stuck. There's this prayer that I heard from Elizabeth Lesser, and it goes, remove the veils so that I might say what is really happening here and not be intoxicated by my stories and fears. Let me say that again. Remove the veils so that I might see what is really happening here and not be intoxicated by my stories and fears. Specificity, I mentioned earlier. Specificity lies in saying what you feel and meaning what you say. One way that is really helpful to do this when it comes to emotions in particular is to get a feelings wheel, or just Google a feelings wheel, set it as the background on your phone, so that way you have more vocabulary to more accurately describe how you're feeling. Instead of throwing around the words I'm depressed, you can say something oddly specific like I'm feeling melancholy. Or on the other side, if you are not used to admitting that you're actually depressed, which is a very serious condition that deserves proper attention and care and support, then maybe a feelings wheel can help you identify that I'm actually not just feeling sad. I've been stuck in despair for a really long time and I need help. Saying I need help is so brave, it's so honest, it's raw and authentic, and I just invite you to admit to yourself more often when you're in those states that all humans experience. It's part of being human, and yet we lie to ourselves all the time to make ourselves seem less human. But what the world needs is more humans being honestly human. There's something so refreshing about vulnerability, about showing up as you are, about somebody not being afraid to be messy and strange and weird and dorky and vulnerable. Really, I think that is so beautiful. So get a feelings wheel to be real with how you feel so that you can heal. That thing that we're unwilling to feel, that we're scared to admit, that we're afraid will happen, that's exactly the direction of the leap of faith that we need to take in order to break through into ultimate growth. The last way to be honest with yourself, or the last thing to be mindful and careful of, is to not let other people's shitty truths absorb into your psyche. Be careful who you listen to. Be careful what you believe that's coming from somebody else, that's coming from society, from culture, from social media. Don't just absorb and consume other people's truths and pretend like they're the end all be all, because they are not. They might be their truths. I started doing this practice where I add "for you" at the end of every sentence somebody tells me. Okay, so for example, somebody says, a 9-to-5 job is the key to success. For you. Okay, marriage is hard. For you. This isn't possible. For you. Anything you hear that you're like, I don't know if it's going to serve me to believe that. This is not to say that you're invalidating the other person's experience. You can totally validate and listen and be with that person. Also, justice for sympathy, because I feel like we honor empathy so much that we forget that sympathy is also like very kind. You can be sympathetic to somebody's experience without being empathetic and taking it on as your own. Sometimes sympathy is the kindest thing for you and the other person, right? You don't always have to be absorbing all of their negativity, all of their difficult emotions, all of that trauma. Have a sense of sovereignty between other people's beliefs, their truths, their opinions, their experiences, and what you want to create for yourself. In any given moment, ask yourself, what's real? What's here? And what do I feel? I just want to repeat that prayer to you by Elizabeth Lesser that says, remove the veils so that I might see what is actually happening here and not be intoxicated by my stories and fears. Remove those veils, peel back the layers of the onion of your emotions, of your inner knowing, that self-awareness, so that you can see what's actually happening here and not be so consumed by stories and fears that keep you small, that keep you safe, and that keep you stuck. In any given moment, ask yourself, what's real, what's here, and what do I feel? Be real with how you feel so that you can heal. I hope you find my embarrassing little rhymes and musings helpful, and I will talk to you in the next episode of this self-love podcast. Thank you for listening.